Welcome to the Explainer. So, picture this. It's 1940, the world is engulfed in war, and Britain makes India an offer they think is a sure thing. But India's response? Well, it was definitely not what they expected. This whole situation, this clash between a really desperate empire and a determined independence movement, it completely set the stage for the final chaotic years of British rule. Honestly, understanding this moment is absolutely essential to understanding how India finally achieved independence in 1947. All right, so here's our plan for today. We're going to start with the immense pressure that World War II put on Britain. Then we'll dive deep into their proposal, the so-called August offer, and figure out why pretty much everyone rejected it. That rejection leads us straight to Gandhi's very unique response, the Individual Satyagraha. And to wrap it all up, we'll step back and really evaluate the long-term impact of these critical events. So, this is the big question we're tackling today, right? How on earth did a massive global conflict happening thousands of miles away in Europe spark such a personal, strategic, and frankly unusual form of protest back in India? We're about to connect all those dots. Okay, let's set the scene. It's September 1939. World War II has just erupted. And what does Britain do? Without talking to a single Indian leader, they declare that India is now at war. You can just imagine the reaction. This one-sided decision created a huge political crisis and put the British in a really tough spot. They now had to somehow win over Indian cooperation for a war they'd already been dragged into. Now, the Indian response was, well, it was all over the place, far from being unified. You had the Congress Party saying, sure, we'll help, but we want immediate self-government in return. Gandhi himself, hated fascism, but he was really torn on a moral level. Then you had the more radical voices, like Subhash Bose, saying, this is our chance. Let's launch a massive movement for freedom right now. And in the middle of all this was Nehru, making the powerful argument that India couldn't fight for democracy overseas while being denied it right here at home. It was a complete web of conflicting demands. So, by 1940, the war is going really, really badly for the Allies. France has fallen, and Britain is feeling incredibly vulnerable. They desperately needed India's resources and its soldiers. They knew they couldn't just keep ignoring the political demands. So in a move to try and win over Indian leaders, the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, comes forward with a proposal in August of 1940. And this, right here, became famously known as the August offer. At first glance, this offer had some pretty major concessions. I mean, for the first time ever, Britain was acknowledging the right of Indians to frame their own constitution. That's huge. They offered dominion status, okay, not full independence, but a big step up, and they promised more Indians on the Viceroy's council. But, and this is a massive but, the poison pill was hidden in that last point, a veto for minorities on any future constitution. This one little clause, a classic divide-and-rule move, would end up having enormous and, well, tragic consequences. So you might think with all those proposals, someone would be happy, right? Nope. The August offer completely landed with a thud. It failed to satisfy a single major political group in India. In fact, it was universally rejected. But what's really fascinating here is why it was rejected, because the different parties turned it down for completely opposite reasons. And this slide just perfectly illustrates the fundamental deadlock that really came to define the 1940s. On one hand, you have the Congress Party rejecting the offer because their goal was Purna Swaraj, complete independence. They weren't interested in this halfway house of dominion status. And on the other hand, you have the Muslim League, who rejected it because by this point, their demand had become crystal clear. They wanted a separate state, Pakistan. They were no longer interested in any plan for a united India. So with negotiations at a total standstill, Gandhi knew a response was needed. But he was in a bind. How do you protest the British without weakening their fight against what he saw as the much greater evil of fascism? His solution was brilliant. It wasn't going to be a mass movement. It was something entirely new, a very carefully controlled, symbolic form of protest. Yeah, this was not your typical protest. The Individual Satyagraha was an incredibly strategic and unique move. So let's really break down what this thing actually involved and what it was trying to achieve, especially in such a sensitive global situation. You see, the whole idea was about symbolic dissent. This was not about shutting down the government with huge protests. Not at all. Instead, it was designed to publicly and morally register opposition to the war. The goal was to assert the right to freedom of speech, while being very, very careful not to get in the way of the Allied war effort against the Axis powers. The key words here are control and symbolism. Gandhi himself actually handpicked every single participant, the Satyagrahis. The goal was to express the feelings of the people, to stand up for the principle of free speech by speaking out against war participation, and to basically send a clear message to the British. Congress won't disrupt your war, but we will not be silent either. It was a very strategic, moral stand. So how did this actually play out? Well, the movement officially kicked off on October 17, 1940. And the very first person Gandhi chose for this protest was the spiritual leader Vinoba Bhave. Right after him came Jawaharlal Nehru himself. The campaign continued in different phases over the next year. It was paused, then it was revived, before it was finally called off for good in August of 1941, having successfully made its moral point. So, after all that, what was the ultimate significance of the August offer and the individual Satyagraha? I mean, did they really achieve anything? Let's take a step back and really analyze the key takeaways and the lasting impact of this absolutely critical year. All right, let's just boil it all down. The August offer, even though it was rejected, was still historically important. Why? Because it was the first time Britain officially recognized the right of Indians to create their own constitution. That's a huge conceptual shift. But in practice, it was a political failure. On the other hand, the individual Satyagraha was a moral success. It did exactly what it set out to do: protest without causing chaos during the war. Its limitation, though, was that it had a pretty limited popular impact, and it didn't really force the British to come back to the negotiating table. Okay, if you only remember a few things from today, let it be these. The August offer was a constitutional milestone. But that minority veto clause, wow, that was a game changer. It basically handed the Muslim League the power to block any future plans, which gave a ton of legitimacy to their separatist demands. The Satyagraha proved that protests could be smart and strategic, but maybe the most important takeaway is this. The failure to find any common ground in 1940 just pushed the Congress and the Muslim League further into their corners, tragically widening the political divide that would eventually lead to partition. And that's the final thought I really want to leave you with. In many ways, the events of 1940 were a dress rehearsal for everything that was about to come. This inability to find a middle ground, the hardening of political identities, the British strategy of trying to balance these competing demands, it all set the stage for the massive and ultimately tragic events that would unfold just 7 years later. It just goes to show you how quickly things can change and how one failed compromise can have consequences that echo for generations.